Although the topic of migrant labor, particularly Latino migrant labor, has been part of the American cultural zeitgeist for longer than I've been alive, it appears to have recently taken center stage in political discourse. Interestingly, much of this debate is had on purely economic ground. A favorite of the anti-immigration camp is the idea that reducing the amount of cheap labor in our country by excluding migrant laborers from the workforce will raise wages for the jobs they would have otherwise taken. After all, labor is just another commodity, like apples, and is subject to the same laws of supply and demand that we all know and love. Here's a fellow from Turning Point USA epically owning a liberal with that exact point.
What would you say about like the dairy industry and things like that, which their backs are built off of undocumented immigrants?
Hire American.
Then we'd have to pay them more because
Exactly.
Right now
we would have to pay them more, and we would see higher wages, and the middle class in America would boom.
A simple fact obscured by this detached theoretical perspective, however, is that migrant laborers are people. Framing a discussion about human beings as one about labor and markets puts a veil over the very subject in question, making them invisible in the debate ostensibly about them. So, before we pull so far back as to forget about the people themselves, let us ask the question: what is the lived experience of a Latino migrant worker in the United States? Luckily for us, the United States is no stranger to Latino migrant labor, so we've got a lot of material to work with. During the famous Bracero program, the largest guest worker program in American history, many photographers, such as Leonard Nadel, created photo narratives of the laborers. Though primarily intended to display the efficacy of the program in its ability to transform its Mexican subjects into hard-working American patriarchs, by putting these workers front and center, we are offered a glimpse into their world. Here's a picture of some braceros with a bunch of beets. Here's a picture of a guy hauling a big sack. Here's some workers making sure they're not getting ripped off by management. Here's a bunch of naked dudes getting sprayed with DDT. Turns out, the employers of migrant workers don't tend to care very deeply about their employees' health. One study of a North Carolina labor camp found that the employer-provided, and therefore employer-contingent housing for migrant workers were in a state of persistent deterioration. And as most of the workers were undocumented and had dependents, the risk of contacting the authorities was too great. The same went for deterioration of their bodies. In an interview, one worker said, "We're very strong. If something in our body hurts, we don't say anything. We put up with it until it goes away. We don't go to a clinic just because we get cut. We put up with it. It's the way we manage our lives." Even for workers on visas or with citizenship, it's often not worth it to address their health, since every day not at work means a missed paycheck, which can be just as deadly as disease. A worker from California describes his experience as such. "You can go to school if you earn well, work a few hours, and you aren't overworked. If you get sick, you can go to the hospital. But if you have nothing, you earn little, and you work a lot, then no. I'd prefer to not even go to the hospital, even if I am dying." With uncaring employers and no feasible way to address their predicament elsewhere, migrant workers are turned into machines, condemned to slowly die in the service of their bosses. Employers seeing their workers as nothing but a source of labor is not new to Latin America. All the way back in the 1800s, the Spanish Crown operated a smallpox vaccination program in its South American colonies, the explicit purpose of which was not to help the population, but to bolster the kingdom's wealth. At the time, it was believed that the population was decreasing due to smallpox, and curtailing this loss of valuable laborers was seen as a necessary step in maximizing the efficiency of mineral extraction from the continent's mines. Even today, Nicaraguan sugarcane plantations are happy to poison the land they sit on and their workers, only making baby steps towards confronting the resulting chronic kidney disease when forced to by legislative bodies. This dehumanization in the pursuit of profit affects more than just employees. Whether it's leaking crude oil into indigenous water supplies, exposing port city residents to toxic levels of aerosolized lead, or even diverting and contaminating municipal water here in the States, corporations make a clear choice. As long as it is cheaper to poison people than to take proper safety measures, they'll continue to do it. And if someone takes them to court, they're more than happy to toss them in jail. And the people with the least agency, like undocumented workers, especially those who depend on their job to keep dependents back home afloat, have the least recourse when mistreated by those with power over them. Thus, they're put through the most. The health issues endured by Latino migrant workers aren't confined solely to the physical realm. A study in Los Angeles of young adults who migrated alone from Central America and Mexico between the ages of 11 and 17 highlights the mental turmoil caused by the centrality of work in their lives. This work primacy isolates the workers from all other aspects of their lives, reducing them to little more than their labor. On the topic of going to school, one garment worker who migrated at age 14 said, "Sometimes I'm so tired, I get sleepy at school. It's true. It's not that the teacher or what they are teaching is boring. No, I don't see it like that. I always want to learn, but because I'm so tired, I get sleepy. I feel so tired. You also feel mentally exhausted. It's 12 hours of the same sound in your mind. Then you get to class and you still hear the same sound. You spend 12 hours at work, and then another 2 hours sitting in class aside from the 12 hours at work. If you count what time people start work at 6, 7, 8, 9 a.m., and then you spend another 3 hours at school, you spend 12, 13, 14, 16 hours just sitting. Though many workers migrate to the United States intending to send money back to their families, the higher cost of living here evens out the higher wages, oftentimes forcing workers into debt on the loans taken out to pay for the cost of migration. This only forces them to further prioritize their wages. One migrant who did not speak English when he arrived in the US at the age of 15 opted to learn the language through interactions with customers at his grocery store job instead of going to school, where he would not make money. With such a bleak picture painted by the individual view, it's no wonder so many opt instead to reframe migrant labor in the United States through a detached, impersonal lens. Not much use can be made from poverty tourism. Why not analyze the issue from an economic perspective? So, to avoid missing the forest for the trees, let us revisit our iconic wage deflation argument. Does it hold up to scrutiny? Luckily for us, we get 2 real-world case studies on whether or not cracking down on cheap migrant labor works. First, the end of the aforementioned Bracero program, and second, at this very moment. So let's see how well it worked. The paper, Immigration Restrictions as Active Labor Market Policy, Evidence from the Mexican Bracero Exclusion, shows us clearly that, Well, at any rate, it found that agricultural wages were not increased by the restrictions to, and later cancellation of the Bracero program. Instead, farms opted to mechanize production, meaning nobody got the job. This failure was even acknowledged at the time. In 1969, only 5 years after the end of the Bracero program, agricultural economist William Martin called advocates of the closure obviously extremely naive. This alone does not necessarily entail that the current administration's crackdown on migration will be a similar failure. After all, there are certainly differences in praxis between the two. Being a relatively recent event, it's difficult to find large-scale data just yet, but evidence on a small scale is looking bleak. In Texas, ICE raids have ground construction work to a halt, and the supposed hordes of domestic workers eager to pick up the slack are nowhere to be seen. Economic projections aren't looking so hot either. In 2024, migrants accounted for 19.2% of the American labor force. In June of this year, the Economic Policy Institute predicted that the incoming increase in deportations would result in the loss of 6 million jobs, including 18% of construction and 15% of childcare. And judging by what's been happening since in Texas, this premonition may be all too accurate. If anti-immigration advocates were correct about migrant labor lowering wages, they might be excused for dehumanizing the migrants in question in service of this bigger picture economic ideal. But their central argument, being such obvious bullshit and being known as such for 60 years now, throws a bit of a wrench into that logic. How can someone justify to themselves this sort of random, purposeless dehumanization? I mean, I don't want to say it's racism, but in the book Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, author Seth Holmes explores Pierre Bourdieu's notion of symbolic violence, described as the naturalization, including internalization, of social asymmetries. Through interviews with the people of Skagit County in Washington State, Holmes attempts to elucidate how the social suffering of migrant workers, who in this case are primarily for an indigenous Oaxacan group called the Triqui, is normalized, naturalized, and internalized. One of the most important methods of normalization is, of course, just getting used to something. Labor camps are hidden from most of the county. Residents who pass by them on their daily commutes tend to feel bad at first and then simply stop thinking about it. The Mexican workers eventually even become invisible to the white teenagers hired to weigh their strawberries, who are reprimanded for speaking with the berry pickers. With enough repetition, anything can be assumed to be normal. Another aspect is racial essentialism. Putting people in an out-group allows the mind to make any number of excuses for their suffering. In Skagit County, a mestiza social worker justified Triquis people's status as berry pickers by stating that they simply like to work bent over. And the farm's apple crop manager claimed that the Triqui weren't put to work picking apples, a better-paying job, because they don't like ladders anyway. Holmes's book also includes many lovely interview excerpts with a fellow referred to as J.R., who reminisces about committing hate crimes in his youth. Entertainment in my day in Central California was busting a Mexican up. I asked just because. He clarified. You know, knock him out if you caught him on the street, because sooner or later he was going to do you that way. Just beat the hell out of one of them. Catch him out alone and stomp him, man, real good, just because he's a Mex. These racial groupings are often as nonsensical as they are harmful. Different people have different notions of how many and what types of groups there are. In Skagit County, white residents tend to apply the blanket status of Mexican to all Latinos, regardless of citizenship, while people in management positions at farms that utilize migrant labor have a more granular framework which changes depending on the management level of the person applying the labels. Each individual's mental boundaries are drawn differently in order to naturalize the social statuses of others. JR is content to lump all Latinos, regardless of citizenship, under the Mexican label, while a mestiza social worker has to make a more obscure justification for the specific state of Triqui laborers. And the fluidity of these categories has real effects. Many of those in the anti-immigration camp seem to believe that American and Mexican are more distinct categories than they really are. Many families in the U.S. are composed of both U.S. citizens and illegal immigrants. More than 4 million native-born children live with an undocumented parent, and in mixed-status households, undocumented workers account on average for more than half of the household income. Even if deporting undocumented immigrants raised wages, a substantial portion of American households would nonetheless see a drop in income. Perhaps it's time to set aside the paper-thin boundaries we construct between groups and work towards an economic solution that not only works, but works regardless of what arbitrary group you may fall into.